Food impressions from Vancouver, which is in British Columbia, Canada, in Coast Salish territories. I'm afraid I didn't focus the theme of the talk on recession because I forgot that was the theme of the conference and I wasn't online to check. But I think some of the points that I'm going to raise will cover that. Excuse me. Please work. There we go. Okay, cool. This is the first photograph that I took when I arrived in Canada, in Vancouver. I was so pleased to see a community garden as soon as I arrived. But over the first few weeks, my comprehension of this view really deepened, and I began to see things other than the community garden in there. On the top right, you can see the orange cranes of the docks, and that's where a massive amount of food arrives in Vancouver. Just to the left of them, just below the mountains, that white building is the British Columbia Sugar Refining Company. And it's there in all its Victorian glory. It was built in 1891. It's almost as old as Vancouver itself. Vancouver is only 125 years old. It started as a few logging cabins and the trees fell from then on. Next to the refinery in front there is the Canadian Pacific Railway, and it's massively significant to the creation of Canada. As it united the different provinces in the late 1800s, it was built from east to west as an industrial signifier of the unification of various provinces and various colonies. And as you can see from the graffitied train carriage there, it brings grain from the prairie provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, which are grain as far as the eye can see and beyond and beyond and beyond. And the train brings them all the way over to the west coast for export and for use in the region. On either side of the community garden are two massive advertising billboards. Sometimes they advertise food. The labour required to maintain these advertising billboards and to change the images on them was a real eye-opener to me. I only wish we had these two lovely burly guys for a day, which is what it took to change it in that community garden, planting trees. Now, the billboards are there to catch the eyes of the drivers on the 4-lane road, which is the grey section in the middle of that picture. The traffic was constant. It was day, it was night, and so the billboards were well lit. Meanwhile, to the left, under the bridge, there was another form of advertising taking place. Some of the most vulnerable women in Vancouver, the street workers, the sex workers, applied for business there. All in all, this view, which I recognise isn't the best photograph in the world, but in that view, the thing I could see outside the kitchen window were industrialised food, intensive transportation of food, advertising promises competing with reality, traffic to and from work and shops, and prostitution. All of which, it seemed to me, were about getting food, but also were about avoiding one of the most looked down upon activities in our current global culture. Not prostitution, but hand labour food production. The very thing that the neighbours had entered into voluntarily on this rare vacant lot in Vancouver. As a grower arriving late in the season, taking an office job to get me through the winter and beyond, this view got me thinking a lot about food and labour, industrialisation and colonialism, and also about language, both verbal and written language, and also visual language, what we see, what we interpret by what we see. And that's the theme of this talk. Now, unsurprisingly, for a region that looks like this, there's plenty of sea, inlets, islands, and rivers. There's a lot of fishing. This is a fisherman selling off his boat in Steveston in southern Vancouver. Salmon was a very important food source for the First Nations people who've lived in that region for over 10,000 years of sustainable pre-contact living. Canneries on contact opened all along the coast. The first hired labour was First Nations. Then there was migrant labour, which was predominantly Chinese initially. They were also treated as second-class citizens, as the First Nations were, even though they arrived at the same time as the white Westerners. Since the canneries and industrial fishing intensified, there's been a decline of fish stocks, and an inquiry is now underway as to determine the cause of the decline in fish stocks. It bottomed out so much in 2009 that they said, whoa, this is such a major industry here, we have to work out what's going on. Meanwhile, there are initiatives to protect salmon spawning habitat, which is, it's not the sort of thing we can do here because it's all too far gone. Whereas there's a chance. There's still a chance to rescue the salmon habitat and to bring it back into production. And the scale of this was massive. I mean, when Chris mentioned Usk, and kind of the River Usk coming down here, when people were talking about food systems, they were really talking about watersheds and on a much bigger scale than I'm used to. And it was really interesting and really relevant to have to look at the local ecosystem and not just the traditional kind of boundaries of council or local authorities or whatever. It was fascinating. Obviously, some of that came from top down from government, but some of it was from communities bottom up, and some of it was non-profits in between. So another kind of habitat restoration and protection project, which I found really exciting. This is a project in Lillooet. That's around 3 hours north of Vancouver. And I'm just going to say, when I say 3 hours north of Vancouver, the nearest public transport you can get, BC is so rural, the nearest public transport to Lillooet is a Greyhound bus an hour away. And Lillooet is considered not even that rural. Which is like, oh, really? Okay. And this project is a collaboration between the First Nations. The woman on the left is from a First Nation locally, and the Botanist Society. There's a botanist on the right-hand side. It's a desert area. It's in the rain shadow of the coastal mountains, and it's very economically hard hit, in a story that's probably familiar to us here in the UK as well, especially in kind of southeast Wales. The local economy was based on particular industry. In this case, it was a veneering plant, which closed down a few years ago. So the settler communities were very hard hit by that in particular, and the First Nations. And this is an initiative to restore the ecology on the site. There's a lot of First Nation involved in the project, in the nursery to raise the seedlings for the habitat plants. This very proud nursery tender is called Genesis. He's very proud of his stuff, of his plants. So the goal is to be able to harvest from the land in traditional ways, and this is a really big eye-opener to me, and this is kind of, it blows all the food for free stuff into a whole other dimension. So this is a group of us helping to plant out on that project, and as one of the botanists said, it's incredibly labour-intensive to restore biodiverse habitats. The best plan is not to destroy it in the first place. Now, settler and colonial ideas of the land, of this area, when they first arrived, kind of mostly between 150 years ago or so, and these words are still used now, was that it was virgin landscape, it was pristine, it was wilderness. And in fact, those words are now really highly contested, because in fact, the First Nations there were operating on a very large scale of agroforestry. They had employed very sophisticated techniques of seasonal migrations, and the land base supported a much higher population of First Nation peoples than was originally supposed. And there were three major disruptions to that. The first one was, a smallpox epidemic hit the communities. They had lower immune resistance to smallpox and wiped out a large swathe of the population. I'd say the figure, but I didn't look it up. No internet. It's terrible. Anyway, but because these places had oral traditions, nothing was written down. So when somebody died, a library died. And the second disruption were the First Nations being forced to live on reserves. They weren't allowed the same settler rights. They were forced to abandon their traditions. Some food celebration traditions were made illegal. They were basically unable to access their local food systems. And obviously this, it's, without dramatizing this, but being real about history, this mirrored a process of enclosure and social upheaval that had happened in Europe over centuries, except in this case, it was telescoped, and it happened really fast and really brutally. And the third disruption was residential schools. This is shown here on a mural on the downtown east side, which is a profoundly deprived area in urban Vancouver. And on the right-hand side, just here, you can see, this is a mother with a child being pulled away from her, and the mother is crying. Now, the residential school system was from the mid-1800s. Aboriginal children were sent to residential school for 11 months of the year. They were forbidden to speak their native language, and they were educated that their traditions and their cultures were backward. A similar process was being inflicted on Aboriginal people in Australia at the same time, and as a Welsh speaker, I couldn't help but note this was also happening at the same time as the Welsh language was being suppressed here, and the notorious Welsh Not. There were 36 languages, distinct languages, along Western BC. Some now only have a few native speakers, but there's an amazing and very inspiring language warriors movement that's actually starting up and coming from the youth. And when I say youth, they're not that kind of distinctly Aboriginal, that many have very mixed heritage now, but they're saying, you know, these languages, they told us things about this landscape. And we want to not just preserve that heritage, but have that heritage in order to go forward into the future. And bringing us back to food and the effect of residential schools, the land work that the people were taught at residential schools was non-management level of land work. It was the menial labour work. And so we can see that colonialism also introduced the class system with a little soupçon of racism. One of the inspiring things is that those, as I say, the traditions are being revived. They're being not just preserved, but they're being re-researched and tested out, new ways of looking at the landscape, trying things out and trialed. And this book is a really exciting example of that and looks at both the past and the future. It's a book called The Earth's Blanket, and I highly recommend it. Now, back to my own activities in Vancouver. I took part in an urban youth-led community garden. I know I'm not that young, but they let me come along anyway. They're that nice. They're very polite in Canada. They basically garden on strips of land in an industrial estate. It's basically grass verges. But they're really interesting because they, as a group, they look at decolonising. That's the word they use in order to try and establish a relationship with the land while not ignoring what's gone before and understanding the process of history and trying to work that through. And they also work collectively to grow together and develop skills. This is everyone eating together, and one of the slogans we had on the poster was eat and grow together. I helped out on some of the work days, and one of the notable things was as we worked, trucks would rumble past, massive trucks, and they're bringing up food from California, and they come to the depots in the middle of Vancouver. This one's called in the middle there. I don't know if you can quite see it. It says Fresh Point, and it's right next to another community garden. And this is a weird phenomenon. Community gardens mean something different in the Pacific Northwest than they do everywhere else in the world, because as many of you know, community gardening is a global movement. They were more what I'd call mini allotments. So those beds that you can see on the right-hand side there, it's just one bed that you'd rent for your family. So it's kind of, it's not on the same scale as allotments. And that asks kind of lots of questions for me about scale and assumptions and what you have access to. But they're great nonetheless. The community gardens are amazing. And after the 2010 Winter Olympics, the City Council set out to create 2010 new community gardens or green spaces. This is some Swiss chard at demonstration site, which is just outside City Hall. And as with the Purple Thistle, people are also encouraged to take up stewardship of very small green spaces. This is a boulevard garden. It's called a boulevard garden. It's between the road and the pavement. There's these huge, wide open North American planning models. But one of the funny things about boulevard gardens, you can see that there's lawn on the other side of the road, and that's what would be there normally. Is actually in the lists of plants that the council gives you of what is suggesting things you can put in your boulevard garden or your green streets plan. There aren't edibles, and they say this is for aesthetic reasons. I don't get that. I think edibles look great. Most community gardens are part of parks, so as they increase in popularity, there's a bit of a question around whether they constitute effectively an enclosure of public space. And like a lot of people, I wonder whether it might be more productive to start looking differently at the gardens around houses. And there's a lot of potential there for that. And possibly here too. I think this is definitely one worth looking at. But it really depends on the space available to you. Now, this is a Google image of where I came from. This is just before I left Canada. My beautiful little urban garden is in the top right-hand side, more or less. This is inner city Bristol in Easton, and this is 3 blocks, as you can see on this space, and I did a quick kind of roof count. There's about 104 houses, and the equivalent space in Vancouver is 1 block and 32 houses. And before we kind of say, oh, everyone's got so much space, that's great, one of the ways there are kind of hidden households is that the basement apartments, mortgage helpers, they're called. I don't think it's the basement apartment that helps with the mortgage, but we'll gloss over that. And it's really interesting seeing this spaced out. It's really regimented. There's a grid system. All the roads go north or south and east and west. And there are all these really big houses always with a front yard at the back and a backyard at the back, obviously. And in some ways, it's really exciting because there's loads of space for food growing. And you can see across the bottom there, those are all lawns because people are too busy. They don't necessarily have time to grow food. And yet there's a bit of a food crisis. And in terms of the amount of energy inputs that are coming in to feed Vancouver. So a friend commented to me that the style here reflects settler or colonial attitudes to what is needed. So we replicate the land use of the higher classes whenever we've got more space. And interestingly, this kind of corresponds to some of the more affluent areas of the UK. You can see a kind of distribution like this, although not obviously in some of the other areas like inner city Bristol. But yeah, it's really exciting as a grower to work in some of these gardens. But that imported idea of landscape, of having a house in the middle of a landscaped area, is so powerful, partly culturally, and sometimes it's in North America, it's really strictly enforced. While I was there, a woman in Michigan in the US was being prosecuted for growing vegetables on her front lawn instead of growing lawn and ornamentals. And the same thing was happening in Quebec just a couple of months ago. She's kind of, this is insane. This is really weird. Why would it be illegal to cultivate land, but not for one thing and not another? It kind of just opens up so many questions. The fantastic thing about... Oh, there we go. Being in Vancouver is that Vancouver's actually being really progressive about a lot of this, and they were making headway. So at the moment, growing veggies on your own plot was legal, that was great, and that while bylaws prohibit commercial growing, that's actually under review and being changed. At the moment, they have a policy of non-enforcement. And also, they recently changed the ordinance so that backyard chickens could be grown, because there's enough space for that really easily, and also changed the bylaws so that farmers' markets could operate legally. There are some really interesting projects in the downtown east side, which is a high density residential area with really severe social problems. This project provides employment and training. This one's fascinating and very urban, so this is kind of speaks to what I was asked to kind of mention. Soul food makes a virtue out of the fact that it's incredibly hard to obtain land tenure for food growing. So what they do is they grow it in big containers, essentially, which can be moved. Their latest project is like a field of pallet-raised box containers that you can take whatever it is, those little beep, beep, beep things and kind of lift. And you can move it from one concrete-covered area to another, depending on whether or not your tenure has been wound up at a particular car park that's now going to develop to a supermarket, and you can move it elsewhere. So it's a really exciting, interesting project. But obviously it doesn't address two major structural problems in terms of food system. Firstly, which is that container gardening, as I'm sure many of you know, requires a lot more inputs. It's like having a zoo instead of a safari park. It requires a lot of inputs. It's not possible to establish long-term relationships between the plants. Somebody asked a question about soil earlier and kind of how to explain. Well, one of the things is that soil is like the plant's social networking site. You know, this is where they talk, this is how they have interactions. There are a lot more research, and some of it is coming out of BC, out of the University of British Columbia, about how fungi and all kinds of things, and how plants are actually communicating and interacting with each other through the soil and by being near each other, which you don't get if all you're doing is growing short-term annuals in a container. They can't kind of build ecosystems that are reliant on each other instead of you. The second problem that we all need to address is that while the project does provide employment and training, it's in a field which is notorious for the lack of labour rights and long-term stability. And it seems to me those problems are magnified for people who are already vulnerable and have been economically disadvantaged in other ways. And that's just an issue we all need to start looking at and addressing. I did have a fantastic time in Vancouver, and one thing that it really taught me was there are many kinds of solutions. So the last 4 months that I was there, I interned with Yummy Yards. It's a community shared agriculture scheme, CSA, with an 18-week season. This is my colleague, Rosie, with some of the first boxes we provided back in June. Being an urban farm means Yummy Yards, such a terrible but really cute name, works on multiple sites. This is a backyard. This is an early morning harvest that Emmy's doing. This is another backyard where we raise the seedlings, and actually there's some chickens in the back left there. And I think seconds before I took this photo, who was it who mentioned rabbits? Well, some of the Yummy Yards and Urban Digs at Sister Farm, they're raising rabbits. Ours escaped and was busy eating the nasturtiums when we turned up that morning. Shh, don't tell the neighbours. And another site was on a busy junction. You can see it just to the left there. This was on Harvest Day. These guys actually were having a conversation about changing the logistics of Harvest Day. We were running on a tight deadline. They started having that conversation across 2 lines of traffic. I was like, really? Okay. That's urban farming for you. We also had a couple of sites which were almost field scale. I say almost because we've got a tractor in for doing the rototilling to break up the soil and to sort out the couch grass. But after that, everything was done by hand. So it, kind of we mean different things by field scale, but it's all still hand operation. And these were on the agricultural reserve lands, which are on the edges of Vancouver. The Yummy Yards project was highly collaborative. This is Emmy talking to one of the other local farmers. They'd set up a Metro Vancouver Farmers Co-op, and that means they can share some marketing, some market stalls time, and they can also negotiate exchanges with each other for each other's CSA. As a scheme, it was subject to what I would call the revenge of the lawn. We sweated buckets quite happily, digging in compost to the site, only to find out a few weeks later, before the planting was complete, that the owner wanted it to be returned to lawn. And because they were moving out and they were going to be selling it. That was a bad day. We dug out as much as possible of the valuable soil that we'd put in. And it just kind of goes to show lawns are still revered in that way. They're seen as the norm. And in themselves, I just want to say, when I say lawn, I just don't mean, easy care grass. We're talking about fairly sizable lawns that require labour, that require petrol to maintain, and there are plenty of companies in Vancouver doing lawn maintenance. Now, that takes me to this next slide. So Finn, on the left-hand side, he's one of my fellow interns. And as a potential food grower, or a kind of preference to be a food grower and highly skilled individual, like many others like him, he worked for 4 days a week as a jobbing gardener. He described tending landscapes which seemed to be a kind of hollow status symbol for their owners. And the owners didn't really look at the land, they didn't really look at Finn. Finn didn't really exist for him. And that while there was a status attached to these ornamental gardens, and this was I totally bonded around this because this was my experience working in Bristol as a jobbing gardener as well, there was quite often very little of real practical or personal value being grown on those pieces of land. So that's why I was mentioning this morning about needing to look at how we treat our gardens and not just kind of go, foraging happens somewhere exotic in the wild. In comparison, Finn said that his day with Yummy Yards was his sanity day of the week. And working together as a big team on something like that meant we all got to support each other. You get to chat while you're seeding and weeding and so on about life, about philosophy. You're an emotional support to each other, as well as skill sharing, which was immensely valuable. This plot, I'm just coming up to the last couple of slides now. This plot was a community farm on an agricultural land reserve. This is where we had a small plot. Now, there could have been many, many more like this on the agricultural land reserve. But property there is at a premium, so a lot of people have really large properties there. Some people have it for horses. And what Emmy did, this is Emmy who runs Yummy Yards, she built up a business plan and was really highly mentored for it, and everyone was really excited about this plan to market to the fact that other people on the agricultural land reserve could get a $10,000 a year tax break, which she could facilitate if she was allowed, if we were able to grow food on their land. And so she really put tons of effort into that at the beginning of this year and during the spring, only to find there were no takers. One nearly took it, but then didn't. It looked like it was going to be really problematic. And basically, it was this difficult thing of trying to negotiate, trying to talk to people about the need for food and sustainable systems when they can spare a $10,000 a year tax break. And it just kind of felt like we were in different worlds. And so that part of the business plan went nowhere, and it's a bit of a sobering one, but also realizing that sometimes you can go to a lot of creativity and trouble as a grower, as somebody who wants to provide food to their community, and sometimes it won't pay off. I really loved working with Yummy Yards. I'm a great believer in doing things and having critical thinking about them and not letting the critical thinking get in the way of just getting on and doing it as well. There were still a couple of problems with the scheme that I noticed that I really wanted to raise today and I think they really speak to a lot of the issues that have come up today. First of all, one of the problems was creating a beautiful box for people who were able to pay for non-certified but nonetheless organic vegetables takes a lot of logistics. This is just a small part of our harvest day logistics. We have kind of baking sunshine and trying to keep everything cool, keep everything hand washed and clean and perfect. So it's a lot of fiddly manual labour. And again, this brings me back to it's about, unfortunately, a part of our culture, which I think hopefully we can address in positive ways, about people avoiding hand labour. So the labour involved in harvesting something from your garden and washing it at the tap, by outsourcing that labour to the food industry or to the growers. And the second one was really odd, and none of us noticed it until right at the very end. It was really unconscious. Even though we were supposed to give ourselves the same share as the customers who'd paid cash, so the idea was that some people gave labour, some people gave cash, and some people gave land, and that everyone would get a share of vegetables. We consistently, the people who were making up the box, week after week, undercut ourselves and privileged the paying customers. So despite all our talk, and we talked a lot about this, of valuing our work, about farmers being valued, and trying to create a society which valued food production and harvest, we were vulnerable enough, or perceived ourselves as vulnerable enough, to be scared of losing customers. So the customer role still interfered with our notion of what a community share really meant. Some of us were volunteer labour, and the idea of growers feeding others but not themselves, while wonderfully and magnanimously it's about feeding each other, it's about giving love out into the community, and I'm sure we can all relate to that. It's still massively historically problematic, and it's still massively globally problematic. On a food justice scale, we literally, on a global scale, have people starving while feeding the rest of the world. I wasn't starving while feeding the rest of the world, just kind of saying, it kind of illustrated how something could happen unconsciously. So I came away with it realizing that we really have to look at and critique our cultural assumptions about what's fair when it comes to a fair price for food. But that means not just looking at prices and systems and so on, but also looking at our relationships, looking beyond market-based and customer-based solutions. So we need to be questioning and changing our cultural language, how we talk about plants, landscapes, ecosystems, land use, access, and each other. When I came back, I said to somebody, I really hope I don't end up doing lawn mowing again. And they said, oh yeah, but lawn mowing's the bread and butter for the jobbing gardener. And I'm just like, it's not bread and it's not butter. Okay, question mark. So, seeing fellow human beings as this is Raj Patel, as mere co-consumers blinds us to the deeper connections between us and distorts our political choices. As a consumer of food, you can either proclaim your objections or refuse to buy, voice or exit. There is no space to renegotiate so that everyone gets to eat. That's my emphasis. No way to become a co-producer. There's only supplicating for change or walking away. These are the two words that I came back really wanting to focus on, as well as making a personal journey to maybe reconnect with the language around food, including, for me, the Welsh language. So at some point, I'm going to work out how you say these in Welsh. Thanks for listening.